Hello and welcome to my lecture on sedatives. This is a one lecture series on a drug, or really a group of drugs, which I think are very interesting. This is actually my second time recording this lecture. The first time I got all the way through and I went back and listened to the audio and realized that it sounded like I had taken a bunch of sedatives before recording the lecture. That wasn't in fact the case. I was just tired. It had been a long day, but in an effort to give you a little bit better audio quality and hopefully a little bit more interest and enthusiasm for this topic, I've gone back and re-recorded. So let's get started. Sedatives are, as I said just a second ago, a really interesting group of drugs. They probably deserve a lot of discussion. I'm going to try and pack a fair bit of that into this one lecture. But before we get to the main part of the lecture, let's acknowledge that sedatives are really a diverse group of drugs which can be given different names and sometimes different classifications in different settings. So sometimes we use the term sedatives to refer to all these different drugs. Sometimes some of them are referred to as tranquilizers. Sometimes some of them are referred to as hypnotics. So if you were to crack open a pharmacology reference or a pharmacology textbook, you might have to turn to a variety of different chapters to get all the different information you want for all these different drugs. In a similar way, this diverse group of drugs is sometimes subgrouped into little, subgroups. So we have a group we call the general sedatives. There's another group called the barbiturates. There are the benzodiazepines. There are even other groups that accommodate different drugs, which we might all kind of generally put under the umbrella of sedatives. So lots of different drugs out there. The good news is that they mostly work in fairly similar ways, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on in the lecture. The other good news is they mostly have fairly similar effects. So at low doses of these drugs, or at the doses that they're typically prescribed at, because indeed most of these drugs, or really all of them that I'm going to talk about, were developed as pharmaceuticals to be given specifically for treatment of different disorders. At low doses or prescribed doses, users typically feel kind of a mellow, relaxed feeling. They can feel decreased anxiety and increased sleepiness. So unsurprisingly, these drugs have been and continue to be prescribed for treatment of things like anxiety disorders, sleep problems, etc. At higher doses, or at doses that we sometimes see when we're looking at people who are misusing or abusing these drugs, we find other types of effects like disorientation or feelings of vertigo, loss of coordination, decreased respiration, at least for some of the sedative drugs, which can be fatal in some cases. You can overdose and die on some of these drugs. Also, interesting and disturbing effects like loss of memory or even loss of consciousness, like blackouts. Or even just blackouts and then sort of collapsing into sleep, or even in extreme cases into a coma. Those last few effects of course have been much in the news recently. If you've been paying even a little bit of attention to the unfolding and rather disturbing story of the rape allegations that have been made against actor and comedian Bill Cosby. He is alleged to have, and in deposition has admitted to, having given Quaaludes, which are one of the groups of sedatives, to women so as to apparently increase their willingness to have sex, or potentially to cause them to be in a blackout so they didn't remember having sex with them. Disturbing stuff, unfortunately, but an interesting unfolding story that intersects a little bit with some of the material we're going to talk about today. So with all that in mind, with those preliminaries in mind, let's look at the overview. And kind of like in my previous lectures, I want to first talk a little bit about the history of the drug. I want to talk a little bit about what we know about the current use of the drug, what are the rates of use for some of the different types of sedatives. I'm going to talk a little bit about the pharmacology and the acute effects of these drugs. I'll talk a little bit about the chronic effects of sedatives, and then talk about treatment options for people who are dependent or addicted to sedatives. So let's start with history. In a way, the history of sedatives is an interesting one because it's both a very long history and a very short history. Its long history in the sense that people have probably always sought ways to relax or calm themselves down since the dawn of time. And these different ways to relax have probably included things like calming recreational activities, quiet contemplation or meditation, prayer, what have you, and of course drugs. People have tried to find peace and relaxation through the use of drugs. Now that said, throughout most of history, alcohol was the most popular drug for relaxing, and it, in some ways, I'm sure still is the most popular drug for relaxing. And throughout most of history, there really weren't a lot of other options. We might make an exception for opium, which can produce a calm, sort of peaceful, relaxed state. But for the purposes of this lecture, it's worth acknowledging that alcohol and opium are typically not included as sedatives, although in the case of alcohol, there are some common mechanisms and pathways involved. And indeed, in at least one textbook I have, alcohol is classed as a sedative hypnotic, which suggests some of the commonalities between alcohol and the sedative drugs. Opium is almost always put off on its own with the other opiate drugs because its effects, while similar to sedatives, are different. There's some additional stuff we'll get to actually in future lectures. So the point is, throughout most of human history, relatively few drug options for relaxing other than alcohol and maybe opium. But that changed in the late part of the 19th century and into the early part of the 20th century. As I've talked about before, this was kind of an interesting period of time in history, in part because the sciences that we now think of, like medicine and pharmacology and even medicine as such, were really coming into their own during that time period. And so with those advances in science and the advances in technology that accompanied them, new options were opened up for developing and for using drugs. And that's true for sedatives as well as it is for some of the other drugs that we've talked about. So if we look back to this time, we see German chemist Justus Freiherr von Liebig. And I'll say right now, I'm probably going to mangle some of the names in this lecture. My apologies for that. Anyway, back in 1832, he synthesized chloral hydrate by messing around with the ethanol molecule, the molecule in ethyl alcohol. And he created a drug which we now class as a general sedative that's still used today. It's a drug which at low doses gives people kind of a relaxed feeling. At higher doses, it can kind of confuse and disorient, and it can even can knock a person out, basically. So one of the first true sedative drugs, thank you modern chemistry, or at least modern chemistry in the 1830s. Shortly later in history, we had a German chemist and a German physician, Hermann Emil Louis Fischer and Joseph Baron von Mering, who synthesized barbitol. Barbitol is the first of a class of drugs which we now call the barbiturates, because they're all based on that original barbitol molecule. And so we see the second group of these kind of interesting sedatives being developed by chemical science. So again, this important idea, or at least what I think of as an important idea, when we look at history through the lens of drugs, we see that changes in technology, changes in science open up new avenues or pathways for finding and discovering drugs and for using them. And that's true when we think about alcohol, nicotine, the various stimulants. It'll be true for pretty much all the drugs we'll talk about. And I think that's something cool or interesting to reflect upon. And to be clear, what these chemists and other folks were doing is they were basically tinkering with the chemical structure of different drugs, trying to change their properties. So taking the barbitol molecule and fiddling with it, adding different chemical subgroups to the molecule, taking them off, so as to change the dose effects of the drug, make the drug hopefully more effective, that is, having stronger effects at lower doses, making it safer to use, having fewer adverse effects or side effects at higher doses. If you think back to the beginning of the semester, you'll recall hopefully the lectures on pharmacology and all that stuff about dose effect curves and like effective dose curves and lethal dose curves. That's what chemists and pharmacologists work on, trying to get a drug which is relatively effective across a range of doses, but not particularly lethal or dangerous across those same range of doses, so that most people who take it will get the effect that they want, in this case, relaxation, but not get the effect that they don't want, which is decreased respiration and risk of death. So just to give an example of that, in the case of barbiturate, by about the middle of the 20th century, in the 1950s, literally thousands of different barbiturate drugs had been developed in chemistry labs. That is, thousands of different variations on the basic barbiturate molecule, and at least 50 of these were brought to market under different names by pharmaceutical companies and sold to hospitals and clinics and doctors who could then prescribe them to their patients. But of course, there are always risks with drugs. That's true for all drugs, with maybe the exception of caffeine, which is pretty safe for most people. In the case of the sedatives, particularly the barbiturates, but also the general sedatives, there are risks of overdose. At higher doses, or when these drugs are combined with other sedating drugs, especially alcohol, we can see decreases in respiration to the point where breathing becomes very shallow and irregular, decreases in heartbeat, loss of consciousness, so the person isn't able to realize that they're slipping into a sort of a coma state, and people can die either accidentally, or people can die deliberately by overdose if they want to attempt suicide. So this is a problem for these drugs. As effective and as useful as they can be, they carry some real risks. And during the 20th century, a number of very bright chemists and pharmacologists were looking around for ways to find, to develop other sedative drugs which would have the same effects as the general sedatives and the barbiturates, but wouldn't carry as much of this risk for overdose. Two of these people were Indra, Kishore, Kacker, and Syed, Hussain, Zaheer. I should apologize, I really looked on the internet but couldn't find good pictures of these guys or even a lot of personal information about the dates of their lifetime. But these were Indian chemists who were interested in developing actually an anti-malarial drug, a drug which could be used to treat malaria, but stumbled upon a drug which they named methaqualone, or which has been since marketed under the name Quaaludes. Now, Quaaludes have sedating properties like the other sedatives, and they were marketed as a sleep aid, in part because of their effectiveness for making you feel sleepy, but also as a safer alternative to barbiturates. Although, to be clear, Quaaludes are not entirely safe. You can overdose on them, especially if you take a lot of them or take a lot of them with alcohol. They can be dangerous to use. But throughout a lot of the second half of the 20th century, Quaaludes were a very successful drug that was marketed, as I said before, for treatment of sleep problems. So here you can see an old magazine ad advertising, the benefits of getting a good night's sleep. If your doctor's prescribed you Quaaludes, and you can see if you squint at the small print at the very bottom, it says a non-barbiturate. This is a drug which doesn't have some of the risks associated with barbiturates. It's this new drug. Now, of course, as much enthusiasm as we might have for new drugs, there are always risks, or always a downside, or potential ways to abuse them. Earlier in the semester, I put some links on Blackboard to movie clips from the movie Wolf of Wall Street. If you've seen this movie, I think it's pretty good. I'm not a huge Martin Scorsese fan, but it's amusing, and it has a number of funny scenes, or disturbing scenes, I suppose, of characters abusing Quaaludes, taking large amounts of them, and then forcing themselves to stay awake so as not to fall asleep, and then experiencing a weird kind of disorienting, kind of loopy high as a result. It's worth watching the movie, I suppose, and you can certainly see plenty of clips on YouTube. I'll maybe link to a couple of them again after posting this lecture online. So again, we see this issue that comes up where a new drug is developed, we think it's going to be much better than the alternatives, but there are problems, at least potentially associated with this new drug. Another new drug, or really new group of drugs, was developed by Leo Henryk Sternbach. He was a Polish-American chemist who synthesized chlorodiazepoxide. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. Basically the first of the benzodiazepines, or the drugs which we sometimes just shorthand as the benzos. Benzos are sedative drugs. They often get put in their own little subgroup because they have their own different chemical structure, but they work a lot like the general sedatives, a lot like the barbiturates, and they have some of those same effects. They're popular because they produce some of those same relaxed feelings that we associate with the other drugs, but they're safer because they're less likely to affect the parts of the brain in the brainstem or the hindbrain that govern your autonomic functioning, particularly your breathing. So you get a kind of a slowing down of various processes in the nervous system, but not so much slowing down of breathing. So there's not as much of a risk for that potentially lethal overdose from taking too much and then having your breathing stopped. And because of this, benzos were widely prescribed or very popular. You've probably heard of the drug diazepam, or more marketed under the name Valium, before. It's a drug which is given to people for anxiety or for sleep problems. And so we see in the later part of the 20th century an increase in the prescriptions written for benzodiazepines and a decrease in the prescription for barbiturates as individuals and their healthcare providers kind of switched from one group of sedatives over to another. Now, I said the benzos were very popular, they certainly were, and they were seen as safer than barbiturates because, of course, there's less risk for overdose and death, but there still is risk for abuse and dependence of these drugs, like we saw with Quaaludes, actually. It's also worth noting that benzodiazepines and sedatives in general have really shown to be a lot less effective than we originally thought for treating anxiety disorders. Some of the enthusiasm for these drugs when they were first developed came from the idea that we could give them to people who have severe anxiety problems and they'd feel more relaxed. And certainly this is the case. For the most part, when you give people these drugs, they feel calm. Although in some cases we observe weird paradoxical reactions where sedatives make people feel more anxious. Generally speaking, most patients feel more calm. And if you have an anxiety problem like generalized anxiety disorder, social phobia, post-traumatic stress disorder, or the like, that calming effect can be really relieving. The problem, at least in terms of treatment, is that these drugs don't take away, they take away the symptoms, but they don't necessarily cure the problem. So a person who's anxious in a chronic fashion who starts to use benzodiazepines or other sedatives might find that he or she has to use them all the time just to avoid feeling particularly anxious, which for a number of different reasons probably is not an optimal treatment. We still sometimes see sedatives given to people who are under acute stress or acute kind of anxious reaction, but ideally they're given for relatively short periods of time so as the person has a minimal risk of becoming addicted or dependent while that person also is transitioning into treatment with an effective psychotherapy like cognitive behavioral therapy for anxiety. So, bottom line is that benzos were probably in many ways an advance over other forms of sedatives, at least in the sense of being safer, but they also carried some risk for addiction and probably aren't as effective for long-term treatment of anxiety as maybe people originally thought. So again, this important idea, and I know I've mentioned this in previous lectures, but I'm just going to quickly return to it, is when we see a new drug kind of enter the culture, there's often a lot of enthusiasm for it. The drug is seen as maybe a new way of a breakthrough, a new way of treating illnesses or diseases, a significant improvement over previous drugs, a drug that won't have all the negatives of the other drugs that we've already been using for whatever we've been using them for. There's often at least some ignorance, though, of the risks associated with the new drug, whatever it may be. Risk of side effects, risk of addiction or dependence. Again, I think that's just one of those interesting themes that you see again and again if you look at the history of drugs. By the 1970s, there was some concern over the overprescription and the potential for misuse and abuse and dependence on sedatives, so they were included in the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act. As you know now, repeatedly from what I've told you, this is a federal statute that creates these different categories where drugs are listed, and those categories dictate how easy or how difficult it is for doctors and pharmacists to prescribe those drugs or to give those drugs out to people. Most of the sedatives are on Schedule 3 or Schedule 4, meaning that they have medical uses and have, relatively speaking, lower potential for abuse. although I, for instance, find that kind of questionable because these drugs have a very high potential for abuse, I think. And most of the sedatives are on Schedule 3 or Schedule 4. The last time I checked, Quaalude happens to be on Schedule 1, though, so it's a highly illegal drug. There's not a lot of rhyme or reason to the schedule system. It sort of has a pretense of being based on science, but it often has a lot more to do with kind of general attitudes about which drugs should be relatively hard to get and which drugs should be relatively easy to get. And Quaaludes, are Schedule 1, others are Schedule 3 or Schedule 4. Further on in history, in the 1990s or so, kind of up to modern times, we've seen an increase in the prescription of sedatives, particularly benzodiazepines like Xanax or alprazolam here, pictured. And along with those increased rates of prescription for these drugs, as people have been getting more and more treatment for anxiety and sleep problems, we've also seen an increased incidence in overdoses and adverse reactions associated with using these drugs as well. So if we look at data from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration and the DAWN system, this here is reported on the CDC's website, that's where I found it. Recall that the DAWN system is this network that records hospital admissions related to adverse drug reactions. We can see that in the early to portion of the 2000s, an increased risk, or increased incidence, I should say, in the total number of emergency department visits related to alprazolam, that's Xanax. We'd see similar trends if we looked at some of the other sedatives, although benzodiazepines, particularly Xanax, are among the most popularly prescribed and popularly used sedatives, as I've talked about before. Now, not all of these emergency department visits involve lethality. Not all of these people died, but what happened is, in these cases, typically it's people who are using Xanax and either taking too much of it accidentally or deliberately, or combining it with other drugs and becoming far too sedated, far too disoriented, and either they or their friends and loved ones are getting them to the emergency room. Also from the same data set, we can see that a good chunk of folks, upwards of 4/5 of all cases, involve people combining Xanax with other drugs, kind of like I just said. Certainly there are people who are just using too much Xanax, apparently, and ending up in the hospital, but a lot of the folks who end up in the hospital are combining Xanax with other drugs, and at least some of that time, the other drugs is alcohol. So the combination of drugs is often dangerous. That's true generally speaking, and that includes combining drugs with alcohol. That's true for the sedatives, even the benzodiazepines. With other sedatives like barbiturates or general sedatives, it can be lethal to combine those with alcohol. So with all that in mind, let's kind of get away from history and get into the present day, or as best we know about the present day, the current use of sedatives. As we usually do, we'll start with the Monitoring the Future data set, and we'll look at the rates of use of barbiturates. This is sedatives, but by sedatives we're focusing on barbiturates in the data set. And you can see this general decline in use among high school students from the 1970s through the 1980s, kind of a rebound in the 1990s, and then kind of a drop and a leveling off in the 2000s. So that's kind of similar to the general trends that we see for drugs across the board, and also kind of mirrors the kind of decline in use of barbiturates because of their safety risks, the recognition of their safety risks, and the availability of alternatives during this time period. If we look at the questions on Monitoring the Future that ask about the perceived risk of using these drugs and the disapproval associated with using these drugs, we find, I guess what you'd say, like a moderate perceived risk and a relatively high level of disapproval for using these drugs, that is to say barbiturates, during this time period. Also in Monitoring the Future, we can look at tranquilizers. They ask a separate set of questions for tranquilizers, and by tranquilizers they mean mostly benzodiazepines, and by benzodiazepines they mean mostly Xanax. It's the most commonly prescribed benzo. And so we see kind of here basically a similar pattern, declining use from the 1970s through the 1980s and kind of a rebound in the 1990s and a bit of a leveling off during that later time period. If we look at the National Survey of Drug Use and Health, where we ask just of all people older than age 12, how many people are using barbiturates, or sedatives, meaning barbiturates but not benzos. The lifetime rate of use is maybe 3%. And if we look at benzos, or tranquilizers, meaning benzos, probably meaning mostly Xanax, the lifetime incidence of use is about 9%, or maybe a little bit more than that. So a little bit higher use of benzos than of barbiturates, and that makes sense given what we talked about already. It's also worth noting here, in both these surveys, Monitoring the Future and National Survey of Drug Use and Health, the questions are asked about using these drugs for reasons other than prescribed. So this is not a percentage of the population who's using benzodiazepines or barbiturates or any other sedatives, based on a prescription they got from a doctor or other healthcare provider. It's people who are admitting on the survey that they're using the drug for purposes other than it was intended. Which raises actually an interesting question or suspicion in my mind that these numbers are probably underestimates, because there probably are people out there who were at some point in their lives given a prescription for Xanax, let's say, and can at least lie to themselves or others that they're still using the Xanax for managing quote unquote their anxiety, but are in reality abusing the drug. So just my suspicion that these numbers are probably kind of underestimates of the true rates of misuse and abuse of these drugs. With that in mind, let's talk a little bit now about the pharmacology of sedatives. This is just going to be basically one slide for this topic. These drugs all of them were designed by pharmacists and chemists to be useful for humans. They're almost all of them designed to be water soluble and easily absorbed into the body. So whether it's Valium or Quaaludes or whatever else, you typically take them in pill form. They are absorbed into the body relatively quickly and distribute relatively quickly, by design. Some of these drugs can be injected into the body. There are certainly examples of folks who've tried to do that recreationally, or examples where under medical supervision people are given intravenous injections of sedatives. Probably the most famous example recently involved the death of the singer Michael Jackson, who had a physician who lived in his house and gave him propofol, which is grouped in with the sedatives. It's a really powerful sedative and anesthetic, so puts you to sleep, because apparently he had sleep problems, and that was given intravenously, but a dose was given that was too high and actually just killed him. So most of these drugs, again, water soluble, taken orally and absorbed through the stomach or injected. There are examples I'm sure you can find of people crushing up the drugs and snorting them, or even burning them to vaporize the drug and inhaling them too. Beyond that, the pharmacology of these drugs is highly variable because, of course, they're a diverse group of drugs. So in terms of how quickly they are eliminated from the body, the half-life of a sedative is, from one sedative varies from the half-life of another. Some of them last for relatively short periods of time. Some of them are far more long-lasting, which can be both useful therapeutically and problematic in terms of people misusing or abusing the drugs. You can take some sedatives and still have them active in your system days later, which can be problematic if you then drink alcohol or use more sedatives or try and drive a car. But it's a highly diverse group of drugs in terms of how long-lasting they are. And I thought a little bit about including a table or a couple more slides to highlight some examples of that, but it just seemed a little bit excessive in terms of the amount of detail for this lecture. So a brief bit then about pharmacology. Let's move on and talk about the acute effects of sedatives. Well, the acute effects of sedatives I've described already, but just to briefly return to them and to sort of highlight how they work. In the peripheral nervous system, you'll recall that stimulants sort of shift the autonomic balance in the direction of sympathetic activation and parasympathetic deactivation. Sedatives, unsurprisingly, shift that balance in the other way, towards parasympathetic activation and sympathetic deactivation. So we get kind of a rest response, not a fight or flight response. And you can see that in some of the organ systems highlighted here on this chart. In the central nervous system, again, we see kind of the opposite of what we saw with the stimulants. The stimulants kind of revved up activity in a variety of different areas and systems. In the case of the sedatives, we see basically decreased activity in the hindbrain. Again, in the case of some sedatives, this decreased activity can be fatal because it can involve decreased respiration. Decreased activity in the midbrain, sense of calm and kind of motor slowing and motor discoordination. Decreased activity in the forebrain, changes in emotions, impairment in memory, etc., etc. So stimulants across the board are generally turning things up. Sedatives, no surprise, across the board are generally turning things down. Now, how does this happen? This happens largely because of the fact that all of these drugs, as diverse as they are, all act on one, mostly, neurotransmitter system. And that neurotransmitter system is the gamma-aminobutyric acid, or GABA system. GABA is a neurotransmitter which is used in different parts of the brain for different reasons, but mostly acts as a kind of a slowing down or braking mechanism. It's an inhibitory neurotransmitter, meaning that when one neuron releases GABA and that GABA drifts across the synapse and contacts receptors on another neuron, if those receptors get activated, then that other neuron will decrease its level of activity. It will not be as likely to fire an action potential and communicate to further down the line to other neurons. So if GABA in many ways acts as the brake a lot of the time in a lot of different systems within the brain. And general sedatives and barbiturates basically increase the inhibitory effect of GABA, making a given amount of GABA that is released more effective. They alter the sort of response that receptors make when they are contacted by GABA. The way that neurons communicate involves opening and closing channels in their membranes that allow ions to flow in and out of the cell. And when sedatives are present and GABA receptors are activated, the ion channels typically open, in different patterns than when barbiturates or sedatives aren't present. But the basic effect is they slow down or inhibit activity or enhance the slowing down or inhibitory effect that GABA normally has. And this is true for benzodiazepines as well. The only difference here, and interestingly, is that the GABA systems in the hindbrain, those that involve respiration, are not as affected as they are by general sedatives or barbiturates. So that's why benzos and barbiturates and general sedatives kind of work in roughly the same way, except benzos have less of a risk for an overdose death. So those are some of the acute effects of the drug. Now let's talk about the chronic effects of the drug. In terms of the physical damage associated with sedatives, they're generally well tolerated. They're drugs that are designed to be used by humans and designed to be relatively safe, despite some of the risks involving overdose for barbiturates and general sedatives. There is some evidence that you may have damage to the liver over long-term use, especially heavy use of barbiturates. In the case of all of the sedatives, people can become quite tolerant quite quickly to the drugs, meaning, and part of that tolerance involves your liver just getting more efficient at metabolizing them, but over time the liver can be damaged if you're using too much of the drug. So there's some risk for long-term physical damage with them, although it's probably not as severe a risk as we see with a lot of the other drugs that we will cover. Kind of the bigger issues in terms of the chronic or long-term effects of sedative use have to do with tolerance and withdrawal. Like I already said, tolerance develops for all of these drugs, so they are at a given dose less effective, and for some people that can motivate increased use of the drug. So you can take more pills than you used to, take the pills more frequently than you used to, upping your dose so as to counteract the tolerance that you're developing to the drug. That can be dangerous for almost all sedatives, especially the general sedatives and the barbiturates, because you can put yourself into a range of dose that could be lethal. Interestingly, you can also develop cross-tolerance with alcohol, and that makes sense if you think back to the lectures on alcohol. Recall that alcohol disrupts the GABA systems as well, increasing their inhibitory effects. That's a similar mechanism that we see with the sedatives. So if someone is drinking a lot of alcohol, they'll become more tolerant to sedatives. If they're using a lot of sedatives, they'll become more tolerant to alcohol. That could, at least for some people, lead them to increase their drinking, increase their drug use, which can put them into all sorts of danger, both in terms of acute effects like driving while drunk or blacking out or something else horrible happening to them, or in terms of chronic effects like having liver damage associated with abuse of barbiturates or with abuse of alcohol. So tolerance and cross-tolerance can be a problem, again, because it increases the risk for overdose, at least for some drugs. Even benzos, which are relatively safe, to the extent that you're becoming more tolerant to them, if you're upping your dose and then also drinking more or using other sedatives more, you can damage your body that way. We also see withdrawal when use stops. We see withdrawal for most of the drugs that we're talking about in this class, and most of the time withdrawal is kind of the opposite effect that the active effect that you get from the drug. So instead of feeling calm, you feel agitated. Instead of feeling relaxed, you feel anxious. Instead of feeling sleepy, you have trouble sleeping. Your sleep is disrupted. In extreme cases, which are relatively rare, we can even see kind of profound withdrawal effects that look a lot like alcohol withdrawal for heavy drinkers. That is, things like hallucinations or even seizures. These are really unpleasant, as you would, I'm sure, guess, and they can provide some really powerful negative reinforcement for use. You know, we sometimes call this physical dependence because it suggests this idea that you're really, you feel really physically unpleasant when you stop using a drug, and that motivates you to go back and use the drug again. And so it can be hard to quit using sedatives once you've used them for a while, once you've increased your dose perhaps, and once you become frankly dependent on the drug. So with that in mind, what are the treatment options for sedatives? Well, like we saw with stimulants, there are some behavioral options, meaning just general counseling and therapy can be helpful for people, kind of giving them encouragement to cut down their use, to quit their use, and to manage their relapse, because relapse happens for almost all drugs that we're going to talk about in this class. I talked about cognitive behavioral therapy last time. For stimulants, it is used a lot for stimulants. It can be used also for sedatives. You know, the format of the therapy is pretty similar. You're basically helping the person to recognize the cues that trigger their craving for a drug and learn to avoid them, helping them to recognize the thoughts that they're having that might encourage drug use, and helping the person to learn to change or reframe those thoughts so that they can think in a different way that's going to be less encouraging of drug use. Helping them even to find other ways of relaxing, you know, planning a life that involves activities or behaviors that achieve some of those same relaxing effects that most people want without having to resort to using drugs, especially not sedatives or alcohol as well. In the case of pharmacological treatments, we see detoxification if someone is really severely addicted or really severely dependent on a drug. It may be hard for them to relapse, hard for them to withdraw, to manage withdrawal. You know, they feel very, very unpleasant, they can't sleep, feel really agitated. If they go to a detox program at the hospital or the medical clinic, they can be monitored by doctors and nurses so that their withdrawal symptoms can be watched, and they can be given low doses of benzodiazepines, which again are relatively safe sedatives, or low doses of other medications like sleep aids to help stabilize them and kind of minimize or take the edge off some of those withdrawal symptoms so that the person has a chance to kind of get through that withdrawal period as best as he or she can, and avoid some of that negative reinforcement for relapsing into use. Beyond that, there really aren't any federally approved medications for treatment of sedative abuse and dependence. There appears to be a fair bit of research in this area, but at present there's no one empirically supported and recommended treatment that people can take, at least in terms of medication. It's mostly about detoxifying or going through withdrawal and then managing a life without sedatives, which can be very difficult for people. Back when I lived in Florida, I'm not sure if Xanax abuse, that is abuse of alprazolam, a benzodiazepine, was really more common there, or it was just more visible to me. I knew people who were Xanax users and abusers, and from talking to them, I got the sense that once you get really addicted to Xanax, it can be pretty tough to withdraw from it. It can be pretty tough to live without it. So a word of caution, I suppose: be careful about abusing medications. If you weren't already being careful, take this as a warning. Anyway, that's as far as I need to go in this lecture. I know it's been a little bit shorter than my typical lectures. Probably that's a good thing. In terms of a preview, next time around I'm going to be talking about hallucinogens, another kind of diverse and really interesting group of drugs that I think could spend a lot of time talking about. I'll probably just do 1 or 2 lectures on them, but I hope you'll find that material interesting as I do. And as I always say at the end of these lectures, thanks for your attention. I really do appreciate it. I hope that I've given you some stuff to think about and stuff to be curious about. If you have questions or comments, leave them in the comments area on YouTube or in the discussion boards on Blackboard. I'll do my best to respond to them. So again, thanks very much. If you have a chance, step away from your computer, step away from your tablet, try and enjoy the day a little bit, and when you're ready, come back, because I'll probably have another lecture for you to look at. So, bye-bye.